Hey guys, it's Robin, RsIslandCrafts, and welcome to my craft room. This week we are working on the log cabin block. Now for those of you that already know what a log cabin block looks like, you're going to notice that mine's just a little bit different. It still has the same format. A log cabin block is you start with the center square and you build your blocks around and around. Mine's upside down. And you just keep adding your logs all the way around to get into a log cabin. Now if you do a Google image search or you go to Pinterest and you look at log cabin quilt blocks, you're going to see some amazing quilts. Depending on what fabric you use and the size of your logs, you're going to get different designs. We are just going for wild and crazy scrappy right now. I had 2 fat quarter bundles of this really fun monster fabric. Now in the bundle I've used right now, these fabrics, these 3 or 4 right here are missing. I used those to make a project bag. But otherwise all these fabrics are intact. I found 11 of them. And then I just went ahead and I cut them into strips. I went ahead with 2.5 inch strips. Now because I'd already tried, let me show you something. I was following a different pattern that had you cut your strips at all different widths. And I came out with this really funky wonky one. And it came out looking like this. But when I went to trim it, I was having a really hard time getting a nice 12.5 inch block out of here without having weird little skinny bits. So I went ahead and I took my wide strips and then I cut them down. So now all of my strips are either 2, 2.5, or 2 3/4 inch wide. But that's just me. So what you want to do is you want to start with a square in the center. I decided to use this fabric because it's basically supposed to be trees. You can see the trunk of the tree with the round circle. I wanted something that I wanted it to be a fun color to go with the rest of these the monsters, and I wanted it to be a little bit directional so that I can always tell which way my block was. If I was using a fabric that wasn't directional, if I chose to just use a red block in the center, I would put a pin in the top so that I can always tell which way is up. So I went ahead and I made this test block so you guys could see what it looks like. I'm going for a 12.5 inch block. I don't want to leave that on there too much because you can always see the lights. This one is a straight log cabin. This is not a wonky version. I'm going to show you how to make it a regular version like this, and then I'm going to explain to you also on how to do the wonky. So let's bring the sewing machine over and get started. I'm going to go ahead and try standing up and sewing like this. So if you guys like this setup, just let me know and we can do this more often. I have the capability to zoom us in nicely if we need to. Okay, go ahead and I have my 5 inch square here that I'm going to begin with. You can always start with a smaller square if you'd like. Starting with a little bigger one, I'm going to have that impact of whatever this center square is, and I'm also going to be able to build my blocks, my cabins, a little larger. If you don't want to spend all day making your log cabin blocks, start with a larger center square and maybe make your logs. You can go ahead and make them 3.5 inches if you want. It's all going to depend on the look you want, how big of a quilt you're making, and what fabric you're using. Because if you're using fabric like I am with monsters and stuff like that, you might not want to cut their heads off. I have a whole bunch of strips cut up. I recommend you just cutting a little bit off of one strip off of each width of fabric that you have, or your fat quarters, or your scraps, depending on what you're using, and make one block and see how you like it before you go ahead and cut up all your entire fat quarter bundle and then change your mind. As I'm cutting pieces off, when you're starting, you're going to be putting a 5 inch piece on, but as your block gets bigger, you're going to go all the way up to a 12.5 or 13. As I'm cutting them off, I'm saving them in this little basket I got from the Dollar Tree. These work really nice to hold your projects in, your whips, because you can put all your fabric in your binding strip, even your batting if you'd like. You can put it all in this basket and then set another one up on top of it. They stack on top of each other with this lip, and then you can just put them over in the corner of your craft room or on a bookshelf or on a table somewhere, and you can have all your projects stacked up. So whenever you want to work on one, you can just grab this basket and you know you'll have everything you need in there to work on the project. I love this idea. So out of my little basket, I'm going to go ahead and grab a strip. Make sure it is larger than the piece I'm sewing it to, so I have plenty of room on each side to trim it up. I've decided to use a pale yellow thread in the top thread and the bobbin on my machine, mostly because I'm running a little low on my white and my gray, and if I ever needed to top stitch something, I'll have it. And I have like 3 or 4 spools of different colors of yellow, a pale, a medium, and a dark, and a darker or whatever. And I thought, well, let me just go ahead and use up a yellow. It's really a light color, and since I'm using all medium to dark fabrics, it's not going to show. So if you have thread that you bought just to quilt one quilt with, and you don't actually need it for anything else, like you may never make a light orange or a pale yellow quilt again, go ahead and use it for stitching your blocks together. When you're working on something without any white fabric in it, the chances of your yellow thread showing through is going to be minimal. So I have just a little bit past the beginning where I'm started because I want to be able to square that up, and I don't want to worry about my machine pulling it weird with the feed dogs and having it different lengths. Now I'm going to use the side of my presser foot as my gauge here for about 1/4 inch. It's probably going to be a little bit more than 1/4 inch, but since I'm going to be making blocks that they're not going to set together like as if you were doing a 9 patch or something, so none of my seams are going to match up. So I'm just going to use a steady seam allowance on every block. Whether you use it with your 1/4 inch foot or you line it up with a line on your machine, just make sure you're consistent. And then we're just going to stitch our little seam here. Ooh, stitching standing up was interesting. Bring my needle up, trim it off. Okay, I'm going to go take this over to the iron. I'm going to set my seam, which means I'm just going to set my iron on this, and it's going to allow all my stitches to go ahead and settle into the fabric. And then when I press it open, I'm going to press it away from my center square. After I have it all pressed, I'm just going to go ahead and trim this excess off of these edges. So you go ahead and save this for the start of your crumb blocks, or you can make a ticker tape quilt, or a pillow, or just toss it. Trim your other side. Now since I know that this is where my trees are going, if I didn't have the trees, I would just go ahead and take a pin and place it up there at the top so that I would know the pin top is up this way, that this is the top of my quilt. Now the reason I want to know that is because as we're building this, we're going to build this either clockwise or counterclockwise, whichever your preference is. I just like to go clockwise. So now I'm going to need a strip that goes along here. And once again, we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to line this up, take it over to my machine, and stitch that seam. I'm going to make sure I have a little bit over the tip there. Once again, I'm sticking with the same seam allowance that I had, about 1/4 inch. Put my needle up with my presser foot. Now I'm going to take this over, and I have an option. I can go ahead and trim it here and then press it, or I can press it first. If I want to trim it before I press it, I lay my ruler down along the edge of my block, trim off that extra. Feels like it's getting to be time for a new blade. That's always exciting. And then I'm going to put this piece into my bucket of shorties. So on my next block, I could easily put it here, or I can add it just to my first square. But when I keep them separate that way, it just makes it easier to grab those short pieces instead of digging for it in your big pile of long pieces. And for anyone who wants a quick look, I just go ahead and I put my iron down to set my seam. And then you're just going to press it away. I can't do this left-handed, guys. You're just going to go ahead and press it away from your original block. Press it towards the outside. I know I go a little crazy when I'm pressing it. Okay, now we got to reorientate our block so that we know we have it going straight up. And then we're going to go ahead and put it on this way. Now, if we go ahead and put our log on here and a log on here, we're going to have a very straight log cabin. Now, if we want to make it wonky, there's something we can do. Let's go ahead and start wonkifying this. If I take my next strip, once again, I'm still in my short bucket. Now, if I were to be stitching this and making a regular log cabin and I want everything straight, I would go ahead and just stitch a straight seam. If I want my block to get wonky, I'm going to go ahead and offset this just a little bit. I'm going to leave it up here in the corner. I'm going to put it so, you see how I have it just straight there. I could go like this, but I just kind of like to go diagonally from my corner. And then I can just move this a little bit. And when I stitch this down, it's going to start making my block a little wonky. If you were to fussy cut your center block, and let's say you had a Christmas quilt and you put a snowman in the center, you might not want to wonky on the first row because then you would actually lose some of your snowman and you wouldn't want to cut that off. If you want all your blocks to be, if you want them to line them up kind of nicely and leave all of your centers, if you leave them all the 5-inch squares or whatever size you're using, it kind of makes it a continuity thing where all of your blocks are going to line up. Even though the outsides are wonky, you'll all have this center square nice and straight. So for me, I'm going to go ahead and keep this one straight, and I'm going to go wonky on the next round. So back to the sewing machine. We're going to go ahead and offset our square a little bit, our strip that we add on. Needle up position, lift the presser foot, and there we go. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to trim this and press it. So for me, I think so far this setup is working. It's kind of easy for me to get to spot so I can still show you everything. It's just going to mean some of these videos are going to be a little bit longer, and some of them I just might have to make into 2 parts. I know you guys have told me many times not to worry if they're longer, you don't mind. Press it and press it open. I like a little bit of steam. Once again, I'm going to reorientate my block so I'm back up in the right direction, and I need to put my 4th log over here. Now, since I'm only working with 11 fabrics and many of them are stripes, like 3 or 4, I might end up repeating something before I get to a full 12.5-inch block. But so far, so good. Let me just go put this one on. If you're doing one of those leader enders from Bunny Hunter, is that who it is? Then this is a really good project because you'll be getting a lot. Every time we add a log around it, you're going to be getting another leader ender done, and your secondary quilt will add up really quick. I've never done the leader ender projects, so you'll have to go check out Bunny Hunter's video for that. I can't think of that far in advance yet. Almost, not yet. This time, let's press it first, and then we'll trim it. I like lots of steam when I'm doing my blocks. Now, if you had a pin in here, you have to make sure it's a glass head pin, because if it's plastic, it would melt while you were ironing your block. So you either have to remove it or use a glass pin. Okay, so now we got our first round done. I can go ahead and start my second round. Now I'm going to start doing a little bit of wonkiness. To make sure my strip is long enough to go across it. My next one, as you saw, we went around this way. Now, if you look, there's one seam here, one seam here, but there's 2 seams here. So that means that this is the next log that has to go on because it has multiple seams. These only have single. If we were to put it on here, we would be off our little rotation thing we're doing. So now I'm going to take my strip and I'm going to go ahead and wonkify it. Sometimes you might want to just, if you want to know a number of how far you could actually go when you're wonking it, depending on the width of your strip, the wider your strip, the farther down you can make it wonky. But remember, it's like when one of your blocks are off by about 1/8 of an inch, if you're supposed to be making it at 12 and a half, and maybe you've got it down to 12 1/4 or something, you're off about 1/4 of an inch. Every block you put together, you're going to be off more and more. So if you go to a big depth of wonkiness on this one, by the time you get to your outer rounds, you're going to be really crazy wonky. So we want to do just a little bit. I try to do maybe 1 inch, a little bit more, a little bit less, and I don't want to go too wonky in the beginning. So I know that the distance from my first knuckle to the tip of my finger for most people is 1 inch. See how that works? My husband taught me that little trick. They use that in construction. So I'm going to go and see if it's just about 1 inch from there to there. And I'm going to go from my corner down to here. Now you could just hold this and sew it just like that. But if you're a little uncomfortable with that, you can go ahead and put a couple pins in. I'm going to put my heads on this side away from my seam so that I don't have to worry about taking them out or moving them while I'm sewing. Because that can take extra time and it can get annoying. And you definitely don't want to you don't want to sew over any of your pins. Alright, see how I got that little bit extra wonky going there? I'm just going to stitch and I'm going to follow along the edge of this fabric on top, and I'm going to totally ignore this extra. I'm starting up here at my narrow point where my corner is. I'm going to make sure that I start past here so that I grab all that fabric. And once again, I'm following right along the edge of this green fabric, and I'm ignoring the pink completely. See that? About my 1/4 inch seam, and I ignored this. Now let's go over and take care of this. I don't normally pin it. But as I said, if you feel more comfortable using pins, go ahead. There's no shame in pins. I'm going to get out my bigger ruler this time. And I'm going to line my ruler up right along the side, the edge of this green fabric. You don't have to worry about being exact. You just don't want to make your seam too narrow because it could come undone in the wash. And I'm going to take off this little bit of a triangle here. And I'm going to press it just like I press out any of my other blocks. And then now I'm going to trim off the little tails. When you're doing this one, it's like when we were doing the herringbone blocks. Because you're going at an angle, you want to make sure you have enough room on the outside so you're not running short. So it just becomes easier to trim afterwards. Because you see our strip isn't just quite, it's just a little bit on an angle there, and I wouldn't want to run short. But I'm going to line my ruler up with the main part of the block. I'm going to line my ruler up with the main part of my block so that I can go ahead and just trim off this little tail here. Like I said, keep it, toss it, your choice. Reorientate my block to the top again. Now as I'm building this out, depending on what size I want to make these, I can make it 12 inches, and I need to build it out to that 12 inches. I can keep them small. If I want to have more blocks, I can go ahead and build it to the 9.5 inches. Now I have a little bit extra that I'm short on both sides to go 9.5. Maybe if I'd have chosen to do either a smaller square here or 3 inches, but since I have 2 strips here and only 1 on the sides, I'd rather go to a 12.5 inch. That way I'll get more of each of the fabric in the block, and I'll have more to work with as I'm trimming it up. So you can plan your quilt out ahead of time, or you can just do it as you go. my block is orientated, and once again I have no seams up here. That's my last piece, so I'll always know that I'm going either clockwise or counterclockwise, your choice, to my next piece, because this is the last one sewn, no seams. I have one seam, but I have two seams, so I know my next log is going to go here. I can wonkify this half, or I can keep this one straight. I can go wonky on top and bottom, or I can just do one log. It's all up to you. You're building this cabin. I think this one, now the last time when I did it, I went the top and I went this way. So maybe this one I might want to do just a slight amount, and I'm going to go from the bottom and just have a little itty bit. What have I got? Just over a 1/4 inch, probably about 3/8. And that's just going to give me a little bit of a wonk, and then as I'm building out my rounds, it can build it up a little bit more. Now I have this down in the corner here, and because of the way I did it, I'm going to have to stitch from this top here. It's alright, I can do it. I have to remember to always hold my thread because it gets sucked into the machine so quick. See, this time without the pins, I just hold it, and I can just make sure that I'm in the corner here as I'm going. As long as my seam isn't going like this, I'll be okay. Needle up, press your foot, cut the thread. Do you ever feel like quilting is like a chant thing? You were saying we're doing the same things over and over again, and I tend to say what I'm doing in my head, and sometimes if I'm bored, I might sing a little song with it. No, I'm not going to sing for you today, though. I forgot to trim my little piece. See, it doesn't matter if you don't trim it. Oh, and if you don't have a long enough square, let me get this out of my way. I just had to find my new rhythm over in this corner of the world. You can take your square, start out in the bottom, line it all up with this pink fabric, and I trim the here, and then I leave my cutter right there still. I have all these little pieces here. I would leave my cutter there. I'm going to move it out of the way so you can see, but I would leave my cutter right up against my ruler. Then I would just slide my ruler further up the seam, make sure that it's sitting up against, because I left it right in space, right in this right spot here. My cutter's sitting there, and I would just adjust my ruler against that pink strip and then finish it. So if you don't have a long enough ruler, you can always slide your ruler up and down as needed. And this block is actually scissors friendly. You could use scissors if you wanted to. Not everyone has all their tools when they very first start quilting. If you're going to be making a lot of quilts on a regular basis, these larger ones, I do recommend you grab that 12.5-inch ruler. You can, Joann's puts their notions and their rulers and stuff like that on sale on a regular basis. Otherwise, you can go ahead and use their coupon. It's just a really good squaring up ruler, and a lot of blocks in quilting are 12.5 inches, which is 12 inches finished. So it's a nice ruler to have on hand. Sometimes you can get a whole kit. I got a rotary cutter, I got my mat, and I got the 6x24 inch ruler, and the 12.5 inch ruler as part of a kit many years ago. I don't think they have them anymore, but you can buy them separately still. Michael's has them, and you can also use your 40, 50, 60% off coupon there. And you can use Michael's and Joann's coupons at either store. They accept competitors' coupons. Sometimes the selvages are fun to keep with the little numbers or the little designs on them, and they make a fun selvage quilt. Or you can use it, maybe fold it over for a key ring or something. There's a lot of fun uses for it. Some people cut their selvage off their yardage first and save that, and then they make an entire quilt out of it. If you go to Pinterest is my favorite place to get lost, look up selvage quilts, and there's some amazing ones. This one lady made one with a dancing skeleton. Oh, I loved it. Okay. Back to where we were, because now it's getting to be the end of the day for me, and I get a little chatty. we're orientated properly. We have one log here, two logs, two logs. We have two seams. We know our last log is going to go there. I'm going to go ahead and keep this one straight and not let this one go wonky like the other ones. Now, remember, this is our selvage, and you can see where all the holes are. That's where it's like hooked into the needles on the machine as it's doing whatever it does when it's printing up the fabric. We want to make sure that's past our block. We don't want to include that. It's kind of made out of a different structural, I mean, it's all the same threads and stuff, but the way it's formed, it's just different. It's better to keep that out of our quilts unless we're making a quilt with only those pieces in it. I know, confusing, right? Alright, so I'm going to line this all the way up. We're basically doing rinse and repeat. If you want to make your first block and check it out and see how it works and find the way everything goes together so you know what you're doing. And then after that, you can go ahead and just do string piecing where you can make like 4 blocks at a time like we've done with our crumb blocks and with our herringbone quilts. Or if you want, you can just do one at a time. Totally up to you. I'm not going to give you any bit of a hassle if you feel more comfortable doing one block at a time. If I was doing a quilt, let's say I decided that I wanted to do 4 blocks across of 12.5 inches and 5 down for 20. I personally would probably do, at least in the beginning section, I would do 10, if not 20 of the blocks. But as it got larger, I completely understand just doing one at a time. It's more to handle, and it's just, sometimes it's easier when it's smaller, but it's easier to do one little log at a time when it's larger. Remember, we're just trying to find our comfort zone, and we want to actually make quilts. So if we have to do them a little different than everyone else, that's okay. We're making these quilts and we're getting it done, right? Now, since I went ahead and I made this a straight one, I'm going to go ahead and just trim it. This one's going in my short bin. Now this one, we're not going to trim. See how it's on a little bit of an angle here? I don't want to straighten this out because this is one of my wonky logs. So I want to still, once again, stay with the edge of my block and then trim it. I'm not squaring anything up right now. I am just making my round and round and round logs. Give it a good press once again. Now, as we're getting larger and we finish each round, then we can start measuring it up against whatever we're measuring. A little trick, if you don't have one of these big 12.5-inch rulers, what you can do is find a box, or you could put some cereal boxes and tape them together and cut them out so that they're 12.5 inches. And then you can lay your block on top of it. And if you see your fabric, your paper, and if you see some of that cereal box sticking out, or use file folders, or even go up to the post office and get one of those flat rate, the little envelope ones, the cardboard ones, open them up. I don't remember what the height is. I don't believe they're 12.5 inches. You'll probably have to tape them together. And then put your block on top of it, and you'll be able to see if there's any of that cardboard sticking out. You need to make your block bigger. You can also use that for trimming your blocks. If it's at 12.5 inches, let us just pretend that this ruler is our cereal box, okay? This is at 12.5 inches. I would put my block underneath it so that it's sticking out farther than my 12.5-inch whatever tool I'm using. And then I could lay my long ruler on top of it so that it lines up right along the edge of that cardboard, okay? And then I can take my rotary cutter and trim right along it. You need to go slow though, because it will definitely cut through that cardboard. You can try lining it up and then moving the cardboard out, but I find sometimes it's easier just to lay it on there. Maybe go a smidge, 1/8 of an inch that way, just a little bit, or just be really careful when you line it up and then cut it. You can put blue painter's tape around the edge so you can actually see it very well. That's another way to do it if you don't actually have one of these rulers. there's always a fix. If we don't have the money to get all the supplies we need right away, or we don't have the size we need, there's always a fix. Like the original block that I saw was a 14-inch block. I could do the same thing, make a cardboard cutout so that I can measure everything and then I'll be able to cut it easily. But I just found that I made that 14-inch block and I just didn't like how big it was. I really kind of like my little 12.5 inches, and it makes me happy. Now, of course, 12.5 inches isn't little, but when you're comparing it to 14, it is. Now, I still need to do one more round all the way around. You can see that I have ruler all the way around that you can see the yellow. So I need to do one more round. Put it back to the way every time I'm going to reorientate it so that I don't lose track. Now that we've been talking and I actually had to pause the video to answer a phone call, I'm totally lost at where I am. So once again, the way to find it is one seam, no seams, two seams. So that means I'm going to go here. Plus, since we're going round and round, I can see I've got 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. So I know it's going to go there anyway. Now I just need to decide what I'm going to put there. I think I'm going to put another stripe. And this is where it gets a little bit harder. You got to decide if you're close to your goal of 12.5 inches and you make this too wonky, then you could have some issues. But since I know I'm going to put one more round of logs all the way around, I feel confident that I'll be okay to make this one wonky, and then I'll just have to put some extra along. So let me turn it this way so it's easier. Let me go. Maybe we'll do the full inch on this one just to be wild and crazy, right? So let's go one more round. I'm going to show you all the steps like this on each round, even though it's just repeating the one previously. But when we come and do different styles of log cabins, I might not show you every single step then, because we've already covered it in this video. Okay. So if this is a bit too wild and crazy for you, like I said, you can go ahead up. So now since I was doing this standing up, if I line it up, either my seam was off or when I cut my strip I was off. But it's okay because I'm just going to make sure, I'm going to line up. Yeah, I went a little crazy off the end here and everything, and I went a little off. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make sure that, since this is just a seam, it's not too important. I'm going to make sure that the majority of my seam allowance is under my ruler. And if I have a little extra of this background, then it's not going to be a crisis. I'd rather have a little bit extra of this in my seam, a little bit of bulk, than cutting my seam narrower, because it could ravel while it's being washed. Give it a good press. I don't think no matter how big of a table I have, I will always need extra room. I've seen some really nice, huge cutting tables and stuff, but a lot of those people have theirs all cluttered up with stuff too, so I don't think it's helping them any either. Alright, I know this sounds annoying, but we're going to reorientate ourselves again and figure out where we're going. When we get to this point, we're going to be doing this a lot. Yep, we definitely need a round everywhere. Now, I wouldn't try cutting any of my strips narrower. I would still leave them, like, okay, if your strips are all about 2.5 inches, then I would just leave them and keep using them and trim as you go. If you decided you wanted to have some at 2.5, some at 3.5, some at 4.5, then you want to be choosy. You don't want to put a 4.5 inch strip if you need to only make it 2 inches wider, because that's kind of a waste of that strip. You're going to be cutting off a lot, and what you cut off is not going to be usable in your next block. Now, since I only have a few fabrics to choose from, and I have so many logs going around, I am going to start repeating my fabrics. I just want to make sure I don't put like another one of these 3 fabrics in this section. I could use this stripe, or I could use this pink, and it wouldn't be a problem. But I do have a lot of pink in there, and I have a lot of blue and a lot of green and yellow, so I don't know, you just kind of figure out what you're doing and find a piece of fabric that works for you. I mean, I have a lot of strips, but a lot of them are similar. I could use the blue. I think I'll go ahead and use this yellow orangey. Even though it's yellow there, it has more of an orange tone, so it'll be alright. I'm going to keep this one on the straight and narrow, and I think I'm just going to make my last round even without any wonky. Now, you guys have seen me do all of this. Now, I really feel the need to just say, hey, I'm just going to go ahead and fast forward, but I don't want anyone to miss out on any of the steps. All right, so once again, I've got it lined up a little bit extra up there. Now, as we're going round and round and round in clockwise or counterclockwise, that is called a log cabin block. If we were to do the same steps, but we were to sew it on the top and bottom, and then left and right sides, then I believe that is called the courthouse steps. Oh, court steps, I believe it's called. It's basically the same block, but it's stacked differently, and it kind of looks like columns. But it's the same theory. So if you happen to get your round and round a little mixed up, don't worry about it. Your blocks are still going to be perfectly usable. And if we're making wonky... Mine came a little bit off. That's all right. At least they're wider than... Because instead of pressing them up, I should have pressed it up first and then cut it. Because otherwise now I have these pieces that stick out at a diagonal, but at least they stick out instead of in, so I didn't screw it up. It's completely usable still. Just go ahead and trim off that little extra. Crazy. I am definitely a morning person. I do much better earlier in the day before 3 o'clock than I do after. And right now it's 5 o'clock. Alright, so we need to put 2 more logs on and we'll have this block done. Now, for those of you who are waiting for the next step in our embroidery project, I'm hoping to have that video up for Sunday when we can do our first couple stitches. But I'll have to wait and see what the rest of my week looks like. I have not started on that yet, and today's Thursday. You guys are wonderfully forgiving and very flexible with me, and I truly appreciate that. As you can see, it does take a little while to get one of these blocks built. Anytime you're making a 12-inch block, it's going to take a good chunk of time. But if you wanted to get more done a little bit faster, go ahead and do the, oh, I called it string piecing earlier. Do the chain piecing. I'm sorry. I told you, the brain doesn't always work. Do a little chain piecing and you'll save a little bit of time in different spots. Okay, one more down here. And we'll measure it and see if we're at a good size. I think we'll go this way. If you're using directional fabric for your logs, you just need to be careful when you're laying them down to make sure everything's facing in the right direction. So when you open it up, like my guys are going to be upside down, and I'm okay with that. Since my center square, while it is trees, it really could be turned in any direction. Forgot where my log went. And it would be okay, but if you were using that snowman, you just want to make sure that everything is sitting in the right direction when you put it in. You would also have to be very careful when you cut your strips to make sure they're all facing in the right direction. Let me go ahead and just give this good press all the way across just in case we're trimming it. Sometimes I actually learn from my mistakes. I remembered to trim after pressing. Okay, let's see if we hit our 12.5. Beautiful. Now that I'm at 12.5 inches, I do not expect this square to be directly in the center. I know because my strips aren't all exactly the same, and if I'd have started with a 2.5 inch center and 2.5 inch strips, I would easily be able to center it. But because I have a 5 inch here, and then 2, 2.5, and 2 3/4, plus I wonkified it here and there. There, now maybe you guys can see more of the block. I'm going to move my ruler around on this block to make sure I have fabric sticking out at all 4 sides. I'm going to look at my seams, and I don't want to have just a little 1/2 inch up here and then have 2.5 inches down there. I kind of want to balance it out so I don't lose any fabrics when I'm stitching it to the next block, which is the benefit of having a see-through ruler. Okay, and then I'm just going to trim it. I'm going to start by trimming, just like we would trim anything else. I'm going to trim this right one. Excuse me while I reach in front to do the next one. Then I just take my corner and I spin it around, and this is where I'm going to line up my ruler all the way down to the edge and in the corner so that I can finish squaring up the rest. If somewhere along the line you made a mistake and you were a little bit off or something, you can always add more logs to it to just increase the size. So there is my first wonky log cabin. See how everything's kind of tilted off to the side a little bit? Not everything's all even. I think a wonkiness with this fabric works really well because it's kind of crazy circusy fabric. But maybe if you were using just, let's say you were using semi-solids and you were just using a certain color scheme, you might want to have everything lined up nice and square and neat. Okay, next time I'm going to show you how to do the quilt as you go version. We're going to start out with a regular straight one first, and then we'll see if I can talk you through the wonky, or maybe I can do 2 blocks at the same time. But I hope this has helped you guys out. I know it's probably a longer video even before I start editing it. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and leave them down below. If you enjoyed this video, please think about liking it and subscribing. And if you do subscribe, you might want to ring that little bell next to the subscribe button, because YouTube will let you know when I put out my next video. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me in my craft room. Until the next time, bye!